The single dad burned every dinner, until the new neighbor knocked with soup. At 7:15 p.m., black smoke curled out of the kitchen window of the white two-story house at the end of Maple Ridge Lane. Inside, the smoke alarm screamed like it had personally been betrayed. A man in a crisp white shirt stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon in one hand and a saucepan lid in the other, staring at the stove with the expression of someone watching a business deal collapse in real time. "No," Daniel Sullivan said firmly. "Absolutely not." The pot hissed. Smoke rose higher. Daniel coughed once, waved the lid like a surrender flag, and muttered, "That is not soup. That is a legal problem." From the hallway, 6-year-old Oliver Sullivan appeared wearing dinosaur pajamas and the calm face of a child who had seen too much. "Dad?" Daniel turned too quickly. "I have everything under control." The smoke alarm screamed again. Oliver looked at the pot, then at his father, then at the open window. "Is dinner supposed to be gray?" Daniel glanced at the pot. "It's rustic. It smells like the toaster died." "That is one interpretation." Oliver sighed with the weary patience of someone 3 times his age. For 3 years, Daniel Sullivan had been able to run one of the most successful high-end furniture companies in the country. He could negotiate million-dollar contracts, design luxury showrooms, and speak at investor events without glancing at his notes. But he could not make soup. And every night, Daniel tried again, because 3 years ago, his wife, Emily, had made this same chicken vegetable soup every Friday. Because Oliver used to sit on the counter and steal carrots from the cutting board. Because Emily used to laugh when Daniel pretended the onions were making him cry. Because after she died, the recipe notebook she left behind became the only thing in the house that still felt warm. So Daniel kept trying. And failing. Not because he was careless, because grief had a way of turning even simple instructions into impossible things. "Maybe we can order pizza," Oliver suggested carefully. Daniel turned off the stove. "We ordered pizza yesterday, and it didn't scream." Daniel looked at the ceiling. The alarm continued screaming. "That is a fair point." While Daniel dragged a chair under the smoke alarm and tried to silence it, Oliver slipped away. He hurried to the small table near the front door, where his crayons were scattered beside a half-finished drawing of a family, one tall man, one small boy, and a woman drawn in yellow, because Oliver said that was what remembering Mommy felt like. He pulled out a sheet of paper. With a purple crayon, he wrote slowly, pressing hard with concentration. "Please, if you know how to make soup." He paused, listened to his father coughing in the kitchen, then added, "My dad keeps burning dinner." Oliver looked at the sign, then nodded once. This was not betrayal, this was survival. He opened the front door just enough to slip outside, taped the paper to the door with 3 crooked strips of tape, and ran back inside before his father noticed. 3 minutes later, the new neighbor stopped on the porch. Sophie Bennett had moved into the small yellow house next door, only 2 days earlier, to live with her aunt while saving money for her own apartment. She was 25, an elementary school art teacher, and the kind of woman who could turn a broken shoebox into a castle if given enough glue, glitter, and emotional pressure. She carried a covered pot against her hip because her aunt had made far too much soup, and Sophie had been sent on what was officially called neighborly sharing and unofficially called "please stop eating leftovers for breakfast." She stepped onto the porch, raised her hand to knock, and froze. The sign stared back at her. "Please, if you know how to make soup, my dad keeps burning dinner." For 1 second, Sophie simply blinked. Then she laughed, not cruelly, just a warm little burst of surprise. From inside the house came a sharp beep, a thud, and a man's voice saying, "I am aware the towel is on fire." Sophie's eyes widened. She lifted the pot. "Well," she whispered, "this feels urgent." Then she knocked. The door opened 15 seconds later. Daniel Sullivan stood there, tall, handsome, 32, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly disheveled, a streak of flour on his cheek. The kind of man who looked like he belonged in a magazine spread about luxury homes, not in a kitchen that smelled faintly of disaster. Behind him, smoke drifted through the hallway like an embarrassed ghost. Daniel stared at the young woman on his porch, then at the pot in her hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think you have the wrong house." Sophie raised one eyebrow, then lifted the handwritten sign from the door. "I don't think so." Daniel looked at the paper. His face changed. slowly, painfully. Then he turned his head toward the hallway. Oliver. A small blur of dinosaur pajamas vanished behind the staircase. Sophie pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. Daniel closed his eyes. Of course. I'm Sophie, she said gently. New neighbor, soup carrier, apparently emergency responder. Daniel opened his eyes. I'm Daniel, father of a tiny trader. From behind the staircase came a voice. I can hear you. Daniel called back. Good. That was intentional. Sophie laughed again. It had been a long time since Daniel heard laughter in that doorway. Not polite laughter, real laughter. For a moment, he forgot to be embarrassed. Then the smoke alarm gave one final weak beep from the kitchen. Sophie leaned slightly to look past him. Is everything okay in there? Daniel looked over his shoulder. That depends on your definition of okay. Is anything actively burning? Not anymore. Then we're improving. He gave a reluctant smile. It disappeared quickly, but Sophie noticed it. Of course she did. Art teachers noticed tiny things. Crooked lines, hidden tears, children who said they were fine while drawing storms, and now, apparently, handsome fathers who joked like they were trying not to break. Daniel stepped aside. Would you like to come in? Sophie lifted the pot. I think the soup has already committed to the visit. Inside, Oliver peeked from behind the staircase railing. His eyes went straight to the pot. Is that real soup? Sophie crouched slightly. As opposed to fake soup. Oliver nodded seriously. Dad makes smoke soup. Daniel sighed. I made one smoke soup. Oliver held up 3 fingers. Daniel looked at him. Oliver slowly lowered 1 finger. 2.5. Sophie bit her lip. Daniel pointed at his son. We are discussing your sign later. Oliver looked down at his socks. It was a helpful sign. It was a public announcement. It worked. Daniel had no response to that. Sophie set the pot on the kitchen counter. The room was clean in the way a desperate person cleans after nearly causing a neighborhood incident. A charred pot sat in the sink, soaking like evidence. Oliver climbed onto a chair and watched as Sophie ladled soup into bowls. Daniel reached for plates, then paused. You don't have to feed us. I know. We're strangers. Technically, yes. And you just moved in. Also, yes. Daniel looked uncomfortable. I can pay you. Sophie gave him a look. For soup? For the inconvenience. Daniel, I teach 6-year-olds how to use glitter without creating a national emergency. This is not inconvenience. Oliver whispered. Glitter is dangerous. It is, Sophie said seriously. Thank you for understanding. Daniel watched her speak to Oliver like his words mattered. Not like he was cute. Not like he was background noise. Like he was a person. Something in his chest tightened. Oliver tasted the soup first. His eyes widened. Dad, Daniel braced himself. Yes? This soup doesn't taste scared. Sophie turned away to hide her smile. Daniel sat down slowly. Then he tasted it too. Warm chicken broth. Soft vegetables. Just enough pepper. For one quiet second, Daniel's face changed again. Sophie saw it before he hid it. Oliver saw it too. The little boy put his spoon down. I'm sorry, he whispered. Daniel looked at him. For what? Oliver's chin trembled. For the sign. The room grew still. Daniel's expression softened instantly. He reached for his son. Oliver slid off the chair and stepped into his father's arms. Oliver's voice cracked. I don't want you to eat burned food anymore. Daniel closed his eyes and held him tighter. The strong, polished, successful man who could command boardrooms and build beautiful homes suddenly looked completely helpless. I know, buddy, he whispered. Oliver pressed his face into Daniel's shoulder. And I think, if you smiled more. Daniel went still. Oliver continued, barely audible. Mommy would be happy. Daniel's hand shook against his son's back. Sophie looked down, giving them privacy even though she was standing only a few feet away. For the first time since she knocked, she understood. This was not about dinner. Not really. This was about a little boy who missed the sound of his father laughing, and a father who kept burning soup because he was still trying to cook for a ghost. Daniel opened his eyes. They were wet. He looked at Sophie, embarrassed by how much she had witnessed. But Sophie did not pity him. She only gave him the gentlest smile. Then she pushed a bowl toward him. Eat while it's warm, she said softly. Daniel nodded. Oliver stayed tucked against his side, and for the first time in a long time, dinner at the Sullivan house did not smell like smoke. It smelled like someone had knocked before the loneliness could win. Sophie did not bring soup every night. At least, that was what she told Daniel. "I only made too much," she said the following Tuesday, standing on his porch with a ceramic container wrapped in a dish towel. Daniel looked down at the container, then at her. "That is the third time this week. I'm bad at measuring. You teach elementary school art. Measuring is part of glue survival. I measure with my heart." That sounds legally unsafe. From behind Daniel's legs, Oliver peeked out. "Is it chicken soup?" Sophie smiled. "Tomato basil." Oliver gasped like she had announced a holiday. Daniel sighed. "You see what you've done?" He now believes soup has seasons. Sophisticated children do. Oliver nodded seriously. "I'm sophisticated." Sophie burst out laughing. Daniel looked down at his son. "That was terrible." Oliver beamed. "You smiled." Daniel froze for half a second. Then, very carefully, he looked away. Sophie noticed. She was learning that Daniel Sullivan had many ways of hiding pain. He adjusted his cuffs. He cleared his throat. He made dry jokes with perfect timing. He looked at the floor whenever Oliver said something too honest. But the pain always stayed close, like smoke after a fire. So Sophie never pushed. She only brought soup. Not every night. Just often enough that Oliver began checking the porch at dinner time. Just often enough that Daniel started setting out 3 bowls before remembering he should not assume. Just often enough that the little white house at the end of Maple Ridge Lane smelled less like burned grief and more like garlic, herbs, and the possibility of laughter. Daniel, however, did not understand how to receive kindness without trying to invoice it. On Thursday, he met Sophie at the door holding a white envelope. "No," Sophie said immediately. "I haven't said anything. You're holding money. It's compensation. It's soup. Ingredients cost money. So does therapy. But you don't see me billing you for watching your saucepan commit crimes." Daniel glanced toward the kitchen. "That pot has been through a lot. That pot needs counseling." He tried to hand her the envelope. She folded her arms. "I'm not taking it." "Sophie." "Daniel. I insist. And I decline with artistic confidence. You cannot feed my family for free." "I'm not feeding your family for free. I'm feeding my neighbor, because my aunt cooks like she's preparing for a winter siege." Daniel stared at her. "That doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to. It comes with bread." Oliver appeared beside them and reached for the bread bag. "I support Miss Sophie." "You support carbohydrates," Daniel said. Oliver hugged the bread to his chest. "I can support 2 things." Sophie smiled. Daniel finally lowered the envelope, defeated. The next morning, Sophie found something tucked under the windshield wiper of her car. A glossy card. From Sullivan & Co. Interiors. 30% off any custom sofa, dining set, or home office design. A handwritten note was attached. For emergency soup services. Sophie stared at it, then marched across the lawn in her slippers, hair in a messy bun, holding the coupon like evidence. Daniel opened the door with coffee in hand. She held up the card. "I need soup," she said. "Not a sofa." Daniel took a sip of coffee. "You said you wouldn't take money. So you gave me furniture?" "Discounted furniture. I live in 1 bedroom at my aunt's house. Then perhaps a small chair." "Daniel." "An ottoman?" She glared at him. He almost smiled. Oliver, standing behind him with a backpack, whispered, "Dad think coupons are feelings." Sophie pointed at the boy. "That explains everything." Daniel placed one hand over Oliver's head and gently turned him toward the hallway. "Bus. Now." Oliver walked away laughing. Sophie handed the coupon back. Daniel refused to take it. "Keep it. I don't need it. You might someday." The words landed softer than he intended. Sophie's expression changed. For a second, neither of them joked. Then she tucked the card into her cardigan pocket. "Fine," she said, "but only because I might need a deeply emotional ottoman." Daniel nodded. "They're our specialty." Oliver soon became the least subtle matchmaker in the state of Washington. Every afternoon, he found a reason to visit Sophie. Sometimes he needed help with homework. Sometimes he needed help drawing a dinosaur. Once, he appeared at her door holding a blank sheet of paper and announced, "I have an art emergency." Sophie crouched in front of him. "What kind?" "I need to draw a happy face, but Dad's face is too hard." Sophie looked past him. Daniel stood at the edge of the lawn, pretending to check the mailbox. There was no mail truck in sight. "Your dad's face is not hard." Sophie said. Oliver considered that. It's mostly serious with little cracks. Daniel cleared his throat from the lawn. I can hear you, Oliver called back. Good. That was intentional. Sophie laughed. The phrase had apparently become hereditary. Inside Sophie's aunt's kitchen, Oliver drew while Sophie stirred soup. He told her about school, about dinosaurs, about how his mother used to sing off-key while chopping carrots. He did not say he missed her every time. He didn't need to. Children often drew the thing they could not say. That day, Oliver drew 3 bowls on a table. 1 big, 1 small, 1 empty. Sophie saw it. Her chest tightened. She did not ask about the empty bowl. Instead, she said, "That table needs flowers." Oliver nodded and drew yellow ones. Meanwhile, Daniel attempted to learn cooking with the determination of a man preparing for war. Sophie gave him simple instructions. Low heat, she said. Daniel nodded. Low heat. Stir gently. Gently. Do not answer work calls while cooking. That seems unrelated. It is deeply related. He tried. He truly did. But Daniel's phone rang. A supplier needed approval. A client wanted a showroom change. An executive needed a decision. By the time Daniel returned to the stove, the soup had thickened into something that could possibly be used to repair sidewalks. Oliver stood on a stool beside the counter with a notebook. What are you doing? Daniel asked. Scoring dinner. Sophie leaned against the doorway, trying not to laugh. Oliver looked at the pot. Smoke, 10 out of 10. Daniel closed his eyes. Wonderful. Flavor? Oliver dipped a spoon, smelled it, and wisely did not taste. 2. Daniel turned to Sophie. He's become ruthless. Sophie nodded. Children are honest critics. Oliver added. Texture, sidewalk. Daniel pointed at him. That is not a category. It is now. Sophie laughed so hard she had to cover her mouth. And Daniel, despite the burned pot, despite the failure, despite the old ache rising again as it always did when the recipe went wrong, laughed too. For one clean moment, the kitchen sounded alive. Oliver looked between them, then smiled to himself, like maybe his sign had worked better than he expected. A few nights later, Sophie brought over a pot of vegetable soup and found the front door slightly open. She knocked anyway. Daniel? No answer. Oliver? Still nothing. She stepped inside carefully. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of water running upstairs. On the kitchen counter sat a notebook. Old, blue cloth cover, softened at the corners. A wooden spoon rested beside it. Sophie knew she should not look. She really did. But the notebook was already open. And the handwriting on the page was beautiful, warm, looping, personal. Emily's Friday chicken soup. Sophie's breath caught. Emily, Daniel's wife. The ingredients were listed carefully, with little notes in the margins. Daniel always adds too much pepper. Hide the grinder. Sophie's throat tightened despite herself. There were other notes. Oliver likes extra carrots. Sing during onions so Daniel doesn't pretend he isn't crying. Sophie touched the edge of the page, then immediately pulled her hand back as if she had touched something sacred. This was not just a recipe. It was a room Daniel kept trying to enter. A version of dinner he kept trying to bring back. She turned one page before she could stop herself. Then another. The notebook was full of meals, little jokes, grocery lists, reminders, bits of a life interrupted. Near the end, one page was unfinished. The title had been written at the top. For when you're ready, nothing followed. Only half a line, then a few faint marks where ink had blurred. Not from spilled water. Sophie knew that instantly. Tears had fallen there. Daniel's, maybe. Or Emily's. Maybe both, across different years. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Sophie turned. Daniel stood in the doorway, fresh from checking on Oliver upstairs. His face was pale. For a long second, neither of them spoke. Sophie stepped away from the notebook. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have. Daniel crossed the room slowly and closed the notebook with one hand. Carefully, like closing someone's eyes. She wrote them all before she died, he said. Sophie's voice was barely audible. I didn't know. No one does. He looked down at the blue cover. I keep thinking if I get it right once. He stopped. His jaw tightened. Sophie waited. Daniel swallowed. Maybe dinner will feel the way it used to. There was no joke that could soften that. No clever answer. No easy comfort. Sophie only looked at the man who could build beautiful rooms for strangers, but could not stop standing in the one room where his grief still lived. And for the first time she understood why every burned dinner mattered. Daniel was not failing at soup. He was trying, night after night, to keep a promise to a woman who was no longer there to tell him he was allowed to stop. Sophie did not touch the blue notebook again. She did not ask to read it or say Daniel needed closure. She did not tell him Emily would want him to move on. People said things like that when they were uncomfortable with grief. Sophie knew better. Grief was not a locked door someone else could open for you. It was a room you learned to walk through without turning off the lights. So the next time she came over, she placed a basket of fresh vegetables on the counter, tied her hair back, and looked at Daniel. He looked braced for advice. Instead, Sophie asked softly, "Which soup did she make best?" Daniel stared at her. Not because the question was strange, because it was the first question that did not ask him to leave Emily behind. After a long moment, he looked toward the cabinet where the notebook was kept. "Chicken and wild rice," he said. Sophie nodded. "Then teach me." His brow furrowed. "I thought you were teaching me." "I am, but I never met her." "You did." Daniel looked down. "She added thyme at the end." "Good, what else?" "She said onions only count if they make the cook emotional." Sophie smiled. "That sounds scientifically questionable." She was very committed to the theory. For the first time, Daniel spoke about Emily without sounding like the words were cutting him on the way out. He told Sophie how Emily used to dance barefoot in the kitchen, how she labeled spices wrong on purpose because Daniel once confused cumin with cinnamon, how she had painted one cabinet door yellow during a renovation and refused to explain why until Oliver was born. "Why yellow?" Sophie asked. Daniel's voice softened. "She said every home needed one unreasonable patch of sunshine." Sophie looked at the small boy coloring at the table. Oliver's crayon paused. "I remember the yellow door," he whispered. Daniel turned. "You do?" Oliver nodded. "Mommy said it was where happy things lived." Daniel's eyes shone. Sophie quietly reached for the cutting board. "Then we're keeping the carrots bright," she said. "For the yellow door department." Oliver smiled. Daniel did too, and this time, it stayed longer. Their cooking lessons became a neighborhood event no one was officially invited to, but everyone somehow knew about. Oliver took his role very seriously. He wore a red apron Sophie had painted with the words, "Soup Judge" underneath. In smaller letters, he had added, "and possible dinosaur expert." He stood on a stool at the counter holding a wooden spoon like a microphone. "Welcome back to Cooking with Dad," Oliver announced. "Today's episode is called, Maybe Don't Burn It." Daniel gave him a look. "That title lacks faith. It has history." Sophie nearly dropped the carrots laughing. Daniel pointed at the flour bag. "Please pass me that." Sophie hesitated. "Careful. I can handle flour." "You said that about garlic." "That was one incident. You used the whole bulb. It looked small." Oliver leaned toward his imaginary camera. The judges remained concerned. Daniel attempted to open the flour bag. The bag resisted. He pulled harder. The top burst open. A white cloud exploded across the counter. Daniel's shirt, Sophie's sweater, and Oliver's dinosaur apron. Silence. Daniel stood there, covered in flour, blinking like an offended ghost. Sophie slowly wiped flour from her cheek. Oliver looked at both of them, then lifted his spoon microphone. "Breaking news. Winter has arrived in the kitchen." Sophie laughed first, then Oliver, then Daniel. He laughed until he had to brace one hand against the counter. Sophie looked at him through the floating flour dust, and something inside her went terribly soft. He was handsome when he smiled. But when he laughed, truly laughed, he looked younger, less like a man trapped in the past, more like someone finding his way back. Daniel caught her looking. The laughter faded into something quieter, warmer. For a second, neither moved. Then Oliver said, "Are you two going to kiss or fix the soup?" Daniel coughed. Sophie turned bright red. "Soup," she said too quickly. "Definitely soup," Daniel added. Oliver nodded with deep disappointment. Adults are slow. That evening, the soup did not burn. It was not perfect. Daniel added too much pepper. Sophie forgot the bay leaf until the end. Oliver declared the texture not sidewalk, which everyone agreed was progress. They ate at the kitchen table with 3 bowls, 3 spoons, and a loaf of bread Sophie had brought from her aunt's house. No one said it felt like a family. That would have made it too fragile, but it did. Oliver told Sophie about his school project. Daniel refilled her water without asking. Sophie wiped a dot of soup from Oliver's chin with a napkin, then froze, afraid she had crossed a line. Daniel saw it. He only smiled gently. "It's okay." Those two words settled over her heart. Later, after dinner, Oliver fell asleep on the couch with his head in Sophie's lap, while Daniel collected the dishes. Sophie looked down at the sleeping boy. "He trusts easily," she whispered. Daniel stood at the sink. "No, he doesn't." She looked up. Daniel's voice was quiet. "He trusts you." The room changed after that. Daniel standing at the sink, Sophie sitting beneath the lamp, and a sleeping child between them, like a promise neither was ready to name. The doorbell rang 2 nights later. Daniel opened it expecting Sophie. Instead, he found Margaret Ellis standing on the porch. Emily's mother, elegant, 70, silver-haired, still carrying grief like a black coat she had never taken off. "Margaret," Daniel said, surprised. Her eyes moved past him, into the house, to the kitchen, where Sophie stood beside Oliver, helping him stir a bowl of cookie dough. Oliver had flour on his nose. Sophie was laughing. The yellow kitchen light made the whole scene look too warm, too complete. Margaret's face changed. Daniel saw the pain before the anger. "Who is she?" Margaret asked. Sophie turned at the sound of her voice. Oliver smiled. "Grandma." He ran to her. Margaret hugged him tightly, but her eyes stayed on Sophie. Daniel stepped forward. "This is Sophie. She's our neighbor." "Our neighbor," Margaret repeated. The words were cold. Sophie's smile faded. "I'm sorry. I should go." "No," Daniel said quickly. Margaret looked at him. "How long?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "How long what? How long has she been playing house in my daughter's kitchen?" Oliver flinched. Sophie's face went pale. Daniel lowered his voice. "Margaret," not in front of Oliver. But Margaret's grief had already become a weapon. "Emily has been gone 3 years, Daniel." 3 years. And he's still a little boy. I know that. Do you? Her eyes filled with tears. "Because from the doorway it looked like you found someone to stand where my daughter used to stand." The words hit the room like shattered glass. Sophie stepped back. "I would never." Margaret turned to her. "You don't know what you're stepping into." Daniel's voice sharpened. "That's enough." Oliver began to cry. "Grandma, Miss Sophie made soup." Margaret looked down at him, and her expression broke. "Oh, sweetheart." She stroked his hair. Then she looked at Daniel. "I'm taking him tonight." Daniel froze. "What?" "He can sleep at my house. He needs family. I am his family. And Emily was my daughter." Silence fell hard. Daniel looked at Oliver. The boy was crying harder now, confused and afraid. Daniel wanted to fight, wanted to say no, wanted to close the door. But he saw Oliver caught between the adults he loved, and it crushed him. Margaret held out her hand. "Come, sweetheart." Oliver looked at Daniel. "Dad?" Daniel knelt in front of him, forcing his voice not to break. "It's okay, buddy. Go with Grandma tonight. I'll see you in the morning." Oliver hugged him tightly, then hugged Sophie. "Don't leave," he whispered to her. Sophie's eyes filled. "I'm right next door." But after Margaret led Oliver out, the house felt hollow in a way Sophie had never heard before. Daniel stood in the middle of the kitchen. The cookie dough sat unfinished on the counter. The soup pot cooled on the stove. The blue notebook was closed beside the toaster. Sophie took one step toward him. "Daniel," he shook his head, not angry, destroyed. "She thinks I'm replacing Emily. She's hurting. So is Oliver. So are you." Daniel pressed both hands against the counter, shoulders trembling. "I thought I was doing better." Sophie's voice was gentle. "You are." He looked at the empty chair where Oliver usually sat. "Then why does it feel like I just lost my family all over again?" Sophie had no answer big enough for that, so she stayed, quietly, beside him, as the dinner they had finally made together went cold. Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table long after Sophie went home, staring at Oliver's empty chair. The house was too quiet without him. No dinosaur footsteps in the hallway. No whispered questions from the stairs. No small voice asking if breakfast could be pancakes because toast was just bread that gave up. Daniel had survived boardrooms, funerals, hospital rooms, and 3 years of learning how to be both father and mother to a boy who still drew Emily in yellow. But that night, sitting beside a cold pot of soup, he felt more afraid than he had in a long time. Not of being judged, not of loving Sophie, but of hurting Oliver by being too scared to live. The next morning, Daniel drove to Margaret Ellis's house. He did not call first. If he had, he might have lost his nerve. Margaret opened the door wearing a gray cardigan and the same guarded expression she had carried the night before. "Daniel, is Oliver okay? He's eating pancakes." Daniel nodded. "Good." Neither moved. Then he said quietly, "I'm not here to fight." Margaret's mouth tightened. "I didn't expect you to." "Yes, you did." That made her look away. Daniel took a slow breath. "I still love your daughter." Margaret's eyes closed for one painful second. "I know." "No," Daniel said gently. "I need you to hear it. I loved Emily when she was here. I loved her when she was sick. I loved her when I had to explain to our son why Mommy wasn't coming home." His voice broke, but he kept going. "And I love her now." Margaret gripped the doorframe. Daniel looked past her, toward the quiet house where Oliver was somewhere inside. But Oliver deserves more than a father who only knows how to miss someone. Margaret's eyes filled. "He's still so young." "I know. He still asks about her." "So do I." Daniel stepped back slightly, giving her room for her grief. "I am not trying to replace Emily. Sophie isn't trying to replace Emily. No one could." He swallowed. "But Oliver deserves to see his father smile without feeling guilty. He deserves dinners that don't feel like memorials. He deserves a home where remembering his mother doesn't mean everyone stops breathing." Margaret's face crumpled. For a moment, she looked less like an angry grandmother and more like what she truly was, a mother who had lost her only child. "I walked in," she whispered, and Sophie was standing there with him, in the kitchen, laughing. Daniel nodded. It hurt. It felt like Emily had been erased. "She hasn't. She was my baby." "I know." Daniel's voice softened. "And Oliver is hers." That broke her. Margaret covered her mouth as tears spilled down her face. Daniel did not move toward her too quickly. He simply stood there and let her cry without asking her to be reasonable. After a while, Margaret wiped her cheeks. "There's something I should have given you." Daniel frowned. "What?" She turned and disappeared into the hallway. When she came back, she held a folded page inside a clear plastic sleeve. The paper was familiar. Same cream color as Emily's recipe notebook. Same warm handwriting. Daniel's heart began to pound. Margaret held it out. "I found it in her things after the funeral. I wasn't ready to give it to you." Daniel took the page slowly. His fingers shook. "It belongs at the end of the notebook," Margaret said. "The page that was missing." Daniel looked up. "You had it?" Margaret nodded, ashamed. "I told myself I was protecting you. Maybe I was only keeping the last piece of her for myself." Daniel could not blame her. He unfolded the page. At the top, Emily had written, "For when you're ready, not a recipe, a letter." Daniel's breath caught as he read. "My Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to boss you around in the kitchen, which is tragic for everyone, because you still think high heat means faster love." A broken laugh escaped him. Margaret cried harder. Daniel kept reading. "I know you. You will try to make my soup. You will follow every step too carefully, burn half of it, blame the stove, and pretend the onions are the reason you're crying." His hand covered his mouth. "But sweetheart, please don't cook my soup forever." The sentence blurred. Daniel wiped his eyes and forced himself to continue. "Make it when you need me. Make it when Oliver asks. Make it when remembering feels warm instead of sharp. But don't turn every dinner into a place where I'm missing. Learn a new recipe. Burn that one too if you must. Let Oliver laugh. Let someone help you. Let the kitchen become noisy again. Our family does not end because I had to leave it. It continues every time you love our son well. It continues every time you sit at the table. It continues when you find the courage to be happy and don't apologize for it." Daniel pressed the letter to his chest. He could not stand. He sank onto the porch step, shoulders shaking. For 3 years, he had treated Emily's notebook like a sacred instruction manual for staying loyal, but she had never asked him to stay frozen. She had asked him to live. Margaret sat beside him. Neither said anything for a long time. Then the front door opened wider. Oliver stood there in pajamas, holding a pancake with both hands. "Dad?" Daniel looked up. Oliver saw his tears and came down the steps immediately. Daniel pulled him close. "I'm okay, buddy." Oliver touched the letter. "Is that Mommy's?" Daniel nodded. "What does it say?" Daniel looked at Margaret, then back at his son. "It says we're allowed to make a new dinner." Oliver thought about that. Can Miss Sophie help? Daniel laughed through tears. Margaret closed her eyes. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Yes." Daniel looked at her. Margaret reached out and touched Oliver's hair. "Yes," she said again, this time stronger. "I think your mother would have liked that." That evening, Daniel returned home with Oliver beside him and the missing page tucked carefully inside Emily's notebook. He placed the notebook on the kitchen counter, opened it to the unfinished final page, inserted the letter, then, for the first time in 3 years, he closed the blue cover himself. Sophie knocked softly from the doorway. Daniel turned. Oliver ran to her first. Sophie looked at Daniel, uncertain. He held up the closed notebook. "I think," he said, voice still rough, "we need a new recipe." Sophie's eyes filled. She smiled. "Then we'll start simple." Daniel nodded. "No soup?" "No soup." Oliver raised his hand. "Can we make pancakes for dinner?" Daniel looked at Sophie. Sophie shrugged. "New recipe." Daniel looked at his son, then at the notebook, then back at the 2 people standing in his kitchen. For the first time, the future did not feel like betrayal. It smelled faintly of pancakes. 1 year later, the White House at the end of Maple Ridge Lane smelled like garlic, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and absolutely no smoke. Oliver Sullivan was 7 now, which, according to him, meant he was basically old enough to supervise adults. So he wore his red soup judge apron and stood proudly near the kitchen doorway while neighbors filled the dining room, laughing and carrying plates. Daniel had invited the whole block for dinner, and this time he had cooked. Sophie arrived last, carrying flowers. Before she knocked, she stopped. Beside the front door, the old crayon sign had been framed. Underneath it, Daniel had added a small brass plate. "Solved. Thanks to the neighbor who knocked." Sophie laughed, then immediately wiped her eyes. Daniel opened the door. "You're crying already? You framed emotional blackmail. It was historically significant." Oliver appeared beside him. "It saved dinner." "It saved more than dinner," Daniel said softly. Sophie looked at him, and the laughter in the hallway turned warm and quiet. Later, Daniel carried a large pot into the dining room. Everyone clapped as if he had won a cooking competition. Oliver lifted his spoon. "Smoke score, 0. The neighbors cheered. Daniel smiled. "It's not Emily's soup," he said, glancing at the blue notebook resting safely on a nearby shelf. "It's ours. Chicken, vegetables, wild rice, too much pepper because Daniel still had flaws, and a ridiculous amount of carrots because Oliver insisted joy should be visible." Sophie tasted it. Her eyes widened. "Daniel Sullivan." He looked nervous. "Yes? This is actually good," Oliver gasped. "A miracle." Everyone laughed. Then Daniel reached into his pocket. Sophie's smile faded when she saw the ring box. Daniel lowered himself to one knee in front of the doorway, where she had first knocked with soup in her hands. "Sophie Bennett," he said, his voice unsteady. "Thank you for never trying to replace my past." Her eyes filled. "Thank you for helping me write the future." Oliver bounced on his toes. "Please say yes." Sophie laughed through tears. "Only if both of you promise me something." Daniel smiled. "Anything. The next time something burns, dinner, feelings, anything." She looked from Daniel to Oliver. "Don't hide it from me." Daniel's eyes softened. "No hiding." Oliver raised one hand solemnly. "I promise. Unless it's broccoli." Sophie laughed and nodded. "Yes." Daniel slid the ring onto her finger and stood. Oliver crashed into them first, wrapping his arms around both of them. Daniel and Sophie held him between them in the doorway where everything had begun. One small sign, one burned dinner, one neighbor who knocked, and a family that had finally learned how to keep living. Sometimes, healing doesn't begin with grand gestures. Sometimes, it begins with a bowl of soup, a child brave enough to ask for help, and a neighbor willing to knock on the right door. Daniel didn't stop loving his late wife when he fell in love again. He simply learned that carrying someone's memory and opening your heart to the future can exist together. I believe love isn't about replacing the people we've lost. It's about honoring them by continuing to live, laugh, and share the table with those who are still beside us. What about you? If you were Daniel, would you have been able to open your heart again after losing someone you loved? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories, and join us for more emotional love stories that change lives forever.